All right. So welcome to our, I think it's 15th Think Big? No, 20th Think Big. Oh my gosh. Wow. We've done so many of these. Today we have a guest from the Configure team. It's the PM of Configure, Victor. And he has a topic around Kubernetes agent and integrating that more closely with the release management features. In our agenda, we've dropped in the product issue, as well as some work that the design has been doing. So I'll pass it over to Victor to give like a high broad stroke, and then we can kind of brainstorm, and then at the end think small about what issues we can start creating in the next couple of milestones for this.
Yeah, thank you. So basically, let me try quickly describe how we approach deployments and releases in the Configure team with the GitLab Kubernetes agent, especially. So basically, it's a pool-based style of deployment, and I think the best idea to describe it, I'm going to share my screen in a minute to visualize it, is that basically a user would have multiple projects. I hope that my screen can be seen well. Like an application code repository, that's your generic project. Then I'm skipping these two, the agent configuration repository, where you configure the agent itself in code. So it's not configured through the UI, but it's configured in code, because that's how the people whom we are trying to serve, the SREs, and everybody prefers to do that. And then your agent reaches out to something we call the manifest repository that actually, again, contains the code needed for the deployment. And this code is, in the case of Kubernetes, is a bunch of YAML files. And that's what we want to support, this kind of deployment flows. So this is the basic setup where we operate, that we have a manifest project with a bunch of files that describe your infrastructure, the expected state of that infrastructure, and the agent just grabs those and tells to your cluster that, please provide me this infrastructure. And we have today this setup, and it works at very minimal level. We released the agent 2 months ago, or a month ago actually. And the question is, how could we improve it together with you? And as Jackie pointed out a few ideas very quickly, you have lots of features like the deploy freezes, secrets management, and many other things there that might be interesting for us as well. And if you can cooperate around those, and if you can do that in a user valuable fashion. So it's really just an ideation how we could help each other to gain more adoption, to more visibility, and to provide more valuable features. As a start, what I could say is really this code-driven approach that we are following. The truth is, I don't know much about the release management features except the bullet points type listing. I never use them. So,
well, you're probably using them and you don't know it. That seems to be, the MO with some of the people that I interview. Like environments is a release feature.
Yeah.
And the release environments dashboard, environments index, there's a lot of features that are secretly release management. So I think, Victor, for me, it might be really helpful to step back and look at the job to be done and the pain that we're solving with the Kubernetes agent. So that way I can start wrapping my head around who is the persona that we're targeting here. Because in release management, we think about two main personas: the release manager, which is cutting across multiple projects, and the developer who has to consume the features that release manager or admin then turns on. So I would love to know which part of the funnel are we engaging, and what pain are we solving, and then that might allude to what features we would want to hook in with it.
Okay, so in the past year, I've added two personas to the GitLab persona list. One is called the application operator, and the other is called the platform operator. and they are our core personas. The platform operator, the best how you can, where you can meet a platform operator, if you enter the infrastructure launch Slack channel, they are the platform operator in GitLab's case. So they are really the people who set up the underlying cluster that everybody else is using afterwards. And they are responsible for that cluster. It depends on the team structure, clearly, whether it's how you organize them, but it's the platform operator. The second persona is what we call the application operator, who is responsible for a single or a bunch of applications to be deployed and run, including second-day operations. Does this answer your question? So from the user's point, does this answer your question? I can go into the pain points afterwards.
Go for it.
Okay. So the pain points here are mostly around complexity. Namely, the developers don't really care whether their code runs on Kubernetes or EC2 or whatever, and would like, even the platform operators would like to make a seamless experience for the developers, because that's where they get everything. And this is true for the app operators as well, that everybody here tries to make it easy for the developers to do their work. And at the same time, there is this, let's say, well-known difference between the incentives of the operator and the developer. Like developers would like to move on features and work on features, while operators are really about having a stable environment where things work well.
Okay. So some areas where we're also trying to reduce complexity for the developer are around release generation in the YAML file, which has to be set by the release manager in order for releases to be automatically tagged. I think another area where we can help improve the developer complexity pain point is around setting up Vault or other secrets management stores, because today it's a really horrible experience for users like developers who are trying to leverage the Vault integration but have to set it up themselves. So it's another platform experience that people have.
Just for me to understand, in the case of Vault,
Mm-hmm.
is it that the Vault server would be set up in these terms by the platform operator, and then the developer has to integrate with that Vault, and that's where you try?
Right.
Yeah, that would be, for example, a great integration point for us as well.
Okay, cool. So we may need to talk with Kraz a little bit more about that, because he's the one that's been like super developing against that point. But I think for the team on this call, deploy freezes would also be interesting, because that is something that the operator has to also set. And then the developer is merging changes, but then their stuff could get blocked across projects. So that's another setup thing. And I think, Sean, I would love to hear like your perspective on how you think we can solve some of the pains that we've experienced with deploy freezes and that kind of workflow.
Sure. In fact, thanks, Jackie.
So may I add one more point, Sean, just for you to get a little better understanding? Yep. Just I will get it back soon, and I want this topic just to make it sure that I think this might be related to it as well, is that how we work today, we have this manifest repository, and somehow we have to generate the content, or the user has to generate the content of this repository. And these are actually the release artifacts. So this is what's going to be deployed as is in the cluster. And this is an area that is totally, we have solutions for that, but we're definitely not happy with what we have. And now I'm giving back the word to you, and we'll stop screen sharing.
Yeah, Victor, just to add to the point you just made, actually, I mean, we're still working on a feature which will allow releases to automatically create the binaries associated with that release and publish them to our repository. And in terms of then taking that one step further, so you're saying to take that one step further and then essentially create the next version of the application inside the cluster. Is that what you're referring to?
So basically, I don't know how much I should go into detail, so feel free to stop me. But in the case of Kubernetes, your
Yeah.
cluster is described in a YAML file, a bunch of YAML files. And
Yes.
basically what we are deploying are just these YAML files. And everything else is up to the cluster to figure out how to set up the deployments, the services, how to connect them, and everything like that. And the agent does this deployment. So the agent grabs the YAML files, pulls them from your repository, and applies them in the cluster. What Jackie said, like with deploy phrases, that's clearly a question that how to attach that okay, do I really want the agent to pull those YAML files on Sunday 4 in the morning, or definitely not? Or another question here is that how do I generate those YAML files? Because I can tag them, as you said as well, and then for them to be the releases. But actually, for example, an interesting question here is that we see that other tools like Argo CD and Flux CD, some of them support even tag-based release watching, and that's what they are going to grab. But for example, personally, I don't see yet how widespread use for these are. So there are many open questions on our side here.
Yeah, I've got a few questions for you based on what you just said. So, because you're talking earlier about the the operations group that manage the infrastructure, the Kubernetes cluster, but is this cluster? Are we talking about a cluster that is essentially organization-wide or department-wide or project-wide, associated with a specific project inside of GitLab, for example, which then might have managed apps associated with it? So we already have a process to deploy those. And so because the deploy freeze actually can transcend projects, right? Like it can go, you can basically query it. It's stored in the database, the GitLab database itself, and so it could be part of the YAML to check during a deployment. Is a deploy freeze that covers this particular project and this particular deploy time? But then, because then it's essentially a function of the environments at this point, right? Like whether the whether the environments are deployed or not, based on deploy freeze.
Yeah. Okay. This based on this,
I guess I'm not really sure whether we should be rewriting it's cube.yaml, right? We're not talking about the GitLab CI YAML. We're talking about the Kubernetes YAML.
Exactly.
We're talking about
the Kubernetes.
Yeah.
YAML.
So should we be rewriting that with the information that's in the deploy freeze, or should the YAML just go and query the deploy freeze?
I think it's the latter one. It even shouldn't necessarily be the YAML that queries, because our from an infrastructure point of view, we have a component called CAS. I wanted to say it quickly. Kubernetes agent server that sits beside GitLab, and that communicates with GitLab, and that communicates with the agent as well. So I guess we are adding more and more logic in CAS anyway, and we could add the deploy freeze logic as well, that whenever the agent comes in, wants to check out if there is something new during the deploy freeze time, we just reply, no, there isn't.
Yeah. I guess also the question is, how does this feed back to the user? Like, what's the UX experience if the because the cluster is over here in deep inside the infrastructure, and if for some reason there's problems, how does that get kind of bubbled up to the operators? Or
we are still working on that. So we have some very rough ideas, just some wireframes actually. I think the first issue I added to doc. No, it's not about that. So I can add wireframe based issue links if you are interested. How we imagine this, and yep, here it is.
One thing we discussed was in an environments dashboard, and that's the sort of thing that could be that could connect the back end and the front end in that way.
Yeah, it's very interesting here that clearly we need something. We definitely need some kind of dashboarding around these things. Again, here we see different use cases for the different personas, and I don't yet know whom does the environment dashboard target, because from platform operators' point of view, what I care about is how many pods, how many agent pods are running in my cluster, whether the agent has an active connection, if it has any errors syncing and stuff like that. From an app operator point of view, what I care about is whether my application manifest YAMLs have been synced.
Yeah,
That's
sure.
it.
With the environment's
and logs
running
and everything there. Yeah.
Right. Because the platform operators, they would be using Kubernetes tools, right? They wouldn't be, they wouldn't be wanting to look through GitLab itself, right? Wouldn't they be using? Wouldn't they directly be managing the Kubernetes? Yeah. Okay.
What I've heard from our own SREs is that GitLab is often a great starting point for them. So, for example, when I spoke with Jarvis about the deploy boards we have, he told me that they use deploy boards when they were migrating over to Kubernetes, and then it was a great way to see whether something is green or red. But since we are already on there and they know that everything is green, they said that deploy boards are actually useless for them, and they don't even know what it shows.
Sure. Well, I mean, also, I mean, I don't think we would want to rebuild those Kubernetes management tools. It's a fast-moving area. It's pretty big.
Yeah.
But from a developer's perspective, as you're saying, they just want to know whether their environment's up, and if it's not, what happened to it. And I mean, I think we kind of have some of that information already in the environments page, and then if we expand into an environments dashboard, I mean, we've talked in other think bigs about also having some type of calendar for scheduled as part of deploy fleets as a calendar for scheduled implementations and that type of thing, all linked with the dashboard.
Yeah. One question here that I have is that, to me, environments are really just labels or tags on a CI job or pipeline, and after that, I guess you got a whole bunch of database in a single tag with clever queries. Yeah. So the question here that I have is that today, what environments are from us are actually directories. So I have, as my cluster is described by a bunch of YAML files, actually everything in that cluster is my environment. Everything in the directory is my environment. And somehow I would like to hook into the existing environments features of GitLab, but the truth is I don't know yet how to do that.
Yeah, sure. In fact, we're a bit opaque there, right? Because we have the environment status and we have logs. But yeah, for example, environment can be quite complex, right? It can have multiple different databases. It can have, background services, Elastic, whatever, all these different services. And if you just receive a message that it's not working, and then you kind of have to sift through the logs, it's not the same thing as having, a visualization, for example, saying, here's your SQL database, here's your Elasticsearch database, here's your Redis. Okay, Redis is bad. So as a DevOps, or as a developer, maybe you can fix that yourself with by pushing to the CI, or maybe that has to go to the platform team, depending on what the situation is. But we don't currently have any type of visibility like that. As far as I know, jump in, anyone, if I'm incorrect here, but that's as far as I understand it. We just have logs. Yeah,
seems so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because we've actually added, I mean, if you look at our managed apps, also we've added quite a lot, recently to GitLab. And sometimes I feel a little bit like, wow, we've added all these applications, and how do we kind of see what's going on with all of them? If something goes down, the logs are not always. Logs are usually where you look kind of secondary after you've looked at some type of dashboard.
Yeah. From dashboarding point of view, actually, we have received one feedback again that was from Jar, who said that really for dashboards, what, as you mentioned as well, that probably they would use other tools, and he said that he would be happy to have. He points out one of the Google dashboards. He would be happy to have that in GitLab and nothing more. And that was very strict, that and nothing more, because for everything more he would go for a third-party tool.
Well, I mean, I said earlier about not wanting to rebuild, Kubernetes management tools, but we could consume some of the APIs, right, and represent, some summaries of information.
I think that's what we should do as well.
Inside of GitLab, yeah.
And definitely not rebuild, yeah. Okay, I think we can sooner or later add the ability for deploy phrases. The question is when to add that, but that's definitely seems to be an easy win and something that you built most logic there and the UIs and everything, so we just have to hook into it. I'm still thinking about this, the tagging and how you get to the releases. So how does it work today? Or even the release run books that I know Jackie was or is working on, or you are working on, is that in our case, release run books are the Kubernetes agent. On the other hand, so it's fully automatic in this sense. On the other hand, still what we feed into the run book, that's the manifest project in a sense. And that's why I'm thinking that how could we work on these?
So about run books, they're still pretty immature in that we have like some designs that we're working back on, and the initial introduction of it will be in issue type, and then we'll start to create like more refined runbook functionality as far as like adding steps. And some of the longer term visions that we've discussed are attaching like pieces of your YAML that you want to inject into your YAML file. But this is the GitLab-ci.yaml, not the Kubernetes YAML. So we could add a step inside a run book that says run script in Kubernetes YAML if we're telling the agent to provision something. I think that's definitely like a feature request that we could add as like an option for people to inject into their run books that we create. But it's still in its infancy, and I think there's a lot of flexibility that we can build in there.
I would tell you why I mentioned run, because now what you're describing might be interesting here for both of us. Basically, how I'm trying to. So how do we get to this thing we call the manifest project, the bunch of YAML files? Is that there are plenty of tools. The most well-known is called Helm, but even GitLab is just currently moving away from Helm, or there are considerations to move away from Helm. And we know of some companies who use Ansible just to template the final YAML files. And the basic idea is that even Helm can output the YAML files that we need, and any templating language can output the YAML files that is the content of the manifest project. And we want to keep it like this. We want to make a relatively easy to use, pluggable setup for users to use whatever tool they prefer to have to create the YAML files in the end of their build step and to start the deployment, basically. And here, what you just said, that it's good if it's run through the CI. So like when I set up an example project, what I did was that in the application repo, I had a CI YAML that did the build, and as a last step, created the new YAML file and made a new commit into the manifest repo. So there was a CI part clearly. Another idea we have is that there would be a webhook that calls something in the manifest repo, and what it runs, it's perfectly fine if it runs through the CI, and the CI describes how the YAML file should be updated. And if I understood well what you said, Jackie, this is how you imagine runbooks as well. Am I correct, or I misunderstood you?
No, I think you captured exactly what I was trying to say. It just it enables a better interaction between what people are checklisting as a part of their release process and executing that from their infrastructure.
Yeah.
So
Victor,
we
just take it. Sorry.
so it's like we got really far away from what I think we wanted to accomplish, and we have a couple of minutes left here. So I think what I wanted to kind of recap on, and where we think we should be potentially focusing in the near term, is I think Runbook's priority is going to be a Q1 next year focus. So the back half of this year is finishing up some of our more cross-project features like group releases, group environments. And I think that this Kubernetes agent could really help us with this cross-project functionality. And I'm wondering if there's a way that we can talk about the Kubernetes agent provisioning deploy freezes across multiple projects for users, or provisioning environments. Like if there's something that there's a tangible way to connect some of these cross repository actions that we're now requiring users to manually do, I think that'd be a really big win for us. But I could be I've been trying to research this Kubernetes agent thing, and it might be a little bit out of my depth because I don't use Kubernetes on a day-to-day basis. And when I orchestrated releases in my past, it was more like applications for end users rather than the nitty-gritty details on how we're scaling containers. So
could you elaborate a bit more on this? What you mean by the cross project, whatever?
So deploy freezes are very focused at each repository for the end user. Like they're going to set it at each project, but they would like to control these and administer them. What Sean was alluding to, it transcends the project. So it would be across for a group. And I'm only using deploy phrases as like a micro example of the cross project functionality that we're looking to instrument. But deploy freezes is a good example because today you set it at your project YAML, but it could be for an entire environment that's shared across multiple repositories, or it's a target environment that's shared across multiple repositories.
Yeah, it could be interesting. So clearly the agent in itself is, unfortunately, we miss an important feature with the agent, which is private project support. We are just adding it in these months, and with that, we could have something like that you set up this deploy freezes for your manifest project, and then every project that the agent would deploy is managed by that single deploy freeze setup. But as we are missing private projects, we know that it's a huge problem now that we try to ship actually. But once we have it, deploy freezes are definitely something we can add.
I know we're almost out of time, but I do have one slight disconnect in that, currently the GitLab YAML CI, essentially, assumes the Kubernetes cluster is already there and pushes into it. And it doesn't really manage the cluster, right? So for example, if you want a database, we actually put it in, it might be a step in to install the database, which is not really the same, is not really what you want to do with the Kubernetes manifest, right? Like we're not actually passing it off as a manifest command. It's just kind of like, here's this empty Kubernetes shell with some of the managed apps that have been selected, and then we're installing MySQL. So Kubernetes probably doesn't really manage that MySQL database properly, right? Because it's not.
Are we thinking about this replacing managed apps?
That's a very good question. It's so
because I could see it cannibalizing managed apps. I could see this eating that user.
Definitely. Okay. So what we know about managed apps is that we want to support GitLab features, but we don't want managed apps that we have today. Like, I think you have been involved in the Jupyter discussion as well. It's basically unused.
Yeah.
Elastic Stack is not production ready. Knative is unused. So what we see is that Runner is a highly used GitLab managed app because GitLab CI is around Runner and just great. So we definitely want to add support for that. We already have a POC around that with the agent. But otherwise, what will be the future of GitLab managed apps? I'm almost sure that the UI-based one will be deprecated as soon as we can.
Really?
And what we will have as a code-based one, that's a bigger question where I don't even have an opinion yet. We will have something there, and as you said, Jackie, yeah, it's the agent easily cannibalizes the GitLab managed apps.
So this is where like I want to get super close with you on Vault, because I think if we can
I know that.
configure Vault super easy, then I think that would be a really great I'm trying to think of like a super sweet word for it, but I can't. I think it would just help us release users to set up their Vault instance inside their cluster way easier than the managed app does today. Because today you initialize the Vault instance inside your cluster. You don't have to have an existing, and then you have to do all of the manual hookup with our integration, and you still have to set your roles, policies, and then customers are usually just like, I'm out, this sucks. So I want us to make that better. And if we're going to be eventually replacing the managed app, I don't want to continue investing in the managed app. I'd rather us really look at how we can have the Kubernetes agent go inside the cluster, set up the Vault integration for our users, and then people can just start rolling with their Vault. The biggest thing that there's two use cases there. There's an existing Vault URL that the program manager platform ops person's already set up that the dev has to then connect to, or they want to just use the OSS version of Vault and they don't have an existing URL. So I could see the Vault agent, in this case, the Kubernetes agent for Vault, enabling both. As far as next steps on that, I can create some issues and we can continue the async discussion, because I don't think we'll ever find a time zone for us to meet synchronously all together with the lead developer on there. So I will go ahead and create those issues and we can start the discussion on that front. As far as, I think there's more work to be done on how we can enable release management. I don't thoroughly understand how I would help bake in our features into the Kubernetes manifest, or how this looks from a GitLab-YAML, GitLab.ci-.yaml file versus Kubernetes file, and what we want to reconcile there and how we want the user experience to be. But we can definitely iterate on that in the issues a little bit more.
Yeah. Cool.
Victor, one last question. So is there a plan to expose the manifest YAML, inside of GitLab somewhere? Like how do operators get access to that?
Nathan, this sounds like your question too a little bit. So you may want to chime in on your question after he answers this one.
So I'm not sure that I still understand what you mean. So the manifest project is exposed specifically to the agent, but actually it's a GitLab project. So there's no, it's not hidden at all. It's a full featured GitLab project that just contains the YAML files.
Okay, right.
So it's a separate project. It's a completely separate project for that.
You can use the same project as well, because you can specify that my YAML files are under this directory. So you can have app in source and then infrastructure, whatever directory for that. But basically, it's a GitLab project and a path under that GitLab project.
And those files would never be hand edited, right? Like that's all just pure generated by the CI.
You can even write it by hand. So it's totally up to you. The preferred way is to generate it by the CI.
Cool. I was wondering, in my head, maybe a nice way to generate those would be to attach them to release objects. Like if you created a release and then you had them as release assets, and then I don't know if the agent could pull assets from those releases instead of a separate project. That's one idea.
I understand what you're thinking about actually. And I would say, unfortunately, no. This is something I'm struggling as well with, because so it would be just so great to say that, yeah, this is my release. This is that got released into my cluster. So it totally makes sense what you are saying. On the other hand, in this whole idea behind is that this is pure GitOps, which means that what you are releasing is in Git. Your single source of truth is Git, and it's not a special release artifact. And the only thing we can add here is actually tagging. So I can add the Git tag, and every new tag becomes a deployment. But I don't need this.
which would be
but
a
I don't
release
need-
in this case.
Yeah, that would be a release, exactly.
Yeah, but actually I'm not dealing with the artifact of the release. I'm just dealing with that Git tag and the status of my repository at that tag.
So one other use case that this kind of forks with is when people are building their code for then their developers to build off of. So they're creating like infrastructure as code images, and they want to distribute those through GitLab. And we have a couple of customers who are using release tags for that exact functionality, where they have, this is the infrastructure as code I want people to be building off of. And then they have like, they want to see all the existing repositories who are building off of historical infrastructure as code tags. And I think that this would be really useful for the Kubernetes agent, because we could see how many people are using the most recent version of Kubernetes agent versus historical ones if we were tagging the repository and distribution of the Kubernetes agent, unless if you're expecting those to be not versioned, like if it's not like a versioned dependency there.
I mean, it's clearly versioned even in Git, so it's definitely an option. It's more what I'm thinking about is that if you can use an outdated version at all, because if your agent is running it, so this is the difference between the pull and push based deployment and the agent is a pull based deployment. That here the agent asks GitLab, do you have a more recent version? And whenever the reply is yes, then give me that version. So it's a bit hard to be outdated in this sense.
With that updated version,
that's why we're not using. Sorry.
Might that also entail updated dependencies, right? Or different versions of dependencies, or maybe even new pieces of the stack, for example. So that would then require a change to the manifest, right?
Exactly. Everything is described in the manifest project, your whole cluster or application, depending on.
So if we use GitLab as an example, so we have a specific release of GitLab, and then we add Vault in one of the releases as part of it. Then the Kubernetes manifest.yaml needs to then incorporate Vault of the appropriate version number as a dependency for GitLab, right? Yeah. So isn't it then a little bit circular, right? Because we have to also update we have to push the CI and create the binaries, but then we also have to somehow update the Kubernetes as well.
Yeah, I mean, you could just you update the binary first, you push it to wherever it will be reached at, and after you update the manifest, that okay, this is the new version and this is where you can find it. And then when your cluster applies the YAML file, then it just reaches out to that point. So basically, the YAML file describes the desired state you would like your cluster to be in, and it's.
Oh yes, yes. I completely understand. I guess what I'm saying is the YAML file is in its own project. The Kubernetes manifest YAML file is in its own project, and then we've got the application, GitLab application, and then we've added something new to the stack that didn't previously exist. And so the Kubernetes YAML has to change, right? It's not just a version bump. It's a new node in the tree. And so wouldn't that require someone to go and update manually the master Kubernetes manifest YAML?
It definitely needs an update in the manifest YAML, but there's no master YAML or child YAML. But clearly,
before we could push that, before you could pull that release, we would need to tell Kubernetes, hey, we need this new component. Or do we somehow tell it as part of the release?
That's what the manifest YAML is, right?
No, like we love cats.
Yeah, the problem is that I can hardly pay attention because it just moves wherever I start to think. Then it even it's.
So like I can attempt
down.
Okay.
I'm trying to understand your question, but I think that so like you would update the manifest YAML. Let's say you're adding Vault. see,
Yeah.
I add that to the, let's say I'm doing it manually. I add it to the manifest YAML manually. I push that up to Git. Then as part of the, that would automatically be applied to
Right.
either your cluster, or maybe eventually, if you're rolling out a new version of GitLab, creating a new cluster based on the latest manifest YAML. You're always kind of
Sure.
rolling forward. Does that answer the
Well, you know,
question?
partially because, you know, if we're using the Vault example, so we didn't previously have Vault at all in the cluster, and then we update a new version of our application, and now that application needs this component and it needs Vault. So there's then isn't there then a manual step for the operator to come and update the manifest YAML to say, hey, now we need Vault in this cluster so that the application can start accessing it.
So like if I was deploying Kubernetes, generally don't like upgrade anything. Like I would.
No, sorry. I mean, I mean updating the manifest YAML in the project, and then that gets pushed to the cluster, right? And then it pulls down Vault. But the part I'm not connecting is our application requires this component, and how do we update the manifest YAML non-manually? Yeah,
like the application requires Vault as a dependency. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah, and didn't previously require it. So, you know, of course, we wouldn't update the cluster directly.
Yeah. So in that case, like, okay, so in that case, we're tempted to deploy something of which we have a dependency, right? So then you have to, yes. So in that case, you have a dependency that you'd have to integrate. You know, like in this case, you have Vault as a managed app. I'm not sure that it would be the same setup though that we have now, where like maybe there's some code underneath that's supporting the managed app. It might just be we're just using like remote images that we've created images that we leverage, which is a separate project that we've already pushed.
Like I'm not sure entirely how the managed apps work internally as well, but it's definitely GitLab specific. Right, we're not just pulling an image from somewhere. But I guess wouldn't we need to communicate to the Kubernetes configuration file that we need to have this managed app, right? Because unless we tell it, it doesn't know to pull it. And we would want to try and avoid doing that manually, but the release process just produces binaries. It doesn't produce any YAML saying we now need Vault.
Sorry, I have to leave to another customer call. Nicholas, please.
Yeah, I'll try to.
Well, we're over time anyways. We're 5 minutes over, so I think we can go ahead and end this. But we'll create issues for follow-up and engage on that. Thank you all for this. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks. Yeah, I can stay.